This videotape is prepared for Jenna Morton, who is doing a project for her school on Raoul Wallenberg. My name is Marian Balshon. I was born in Budapest, Hungary, and I was educated in Budapest, Hungary in the Jewish Gymnasium of Budapest. On the time of the Second World War, I was a young teenager. But being in Hungary, Hungary was the ally of Germany, and so the Nazis did not enter the Hungarian borders until the last 11 months of the war. On March 19, 1944, the Nazis entered Hungary, and with that, the beginning of the end started for us. Before that, I was going to school, and the curtailing of Jewish activities was not too bad in Budapest. There was labor camp for the young man who had to join the labor camp, the Jewish young man, and instead of going into the army, they went and dug ditches and fixed railroads in front of the army, without weapons, without anything that would have helped them if they were seized by the enemy, and a lot of young men perished already that way. The other curtailing was the Jewish young people who wanted to enter university could not go because they had numerus clausus and later on numerus nullus, what meant that if they wanted to have a profession, they could not enter universities to become doctors, lawyers, etc. But our life was still going on in a pretty normal way for young people who just went to school. And we had normal activities and socials and cultural events, and it really wasn't bad until that day of 1944, March 19, when the Germans did march into Hungary and took over the total Hungarian regime. From that day on, everybody was curtailed who was Jewish, and every day a different law was secured, and the Jewish people had to abide for it. Beginning of April, the Jewish star was brought in as a law to be worn on the outer garment for Jewish people on the left side above their hearts. That was the day that I got married as a young woman who was already engaged. I just finished school, and we thought that that will help us if we are all together, but of course that was a myth. After my wedding, I decided, and the wedding was not a very happy occasion because we couldn't invite people or anything like that. It was really very sad, but we were young, and we thought that life will go on anyhow. So it's wonderful to believe those things. That day I decided not to wear the Jewish star on my outer garment, and I never wore it from that day on. I was roaming the streets, I did all kinds of activities, but I never put the Jewish star on again. A very few weeks after that, my father was arrested in their home, and the Gestapo took him to a gathering camp outside of Budapest, where they were being prepared to be shipped to the camps, but we didn't even know about yet where. Around the beginning of June, the rumor went around in Budapest that a Swedish man by the name of Raoul Wallenberg entered the city of Budapest with the sole purpose of saving Jewish lives. Now, we didn't know what this man is going to do, but as it turned out, and this is the story that I will relate to you, he saved 3 generations of my little family, what is a miraculous thing, and I do not know another family that 3 generations of them survived, but us did because of the charisma and the wonderful miracles that Raoul Wallenberg has produced. In the provinces, in the meantime, everybody was taken away already, the families of my parents, they had sisters and brothers, uncles, aunts, cousins, they were all shipped away in the beginning of June. But in Budapest there was still a way to survive, and one of them was because of Raoul Wallenberg. The first recipient of Wallenberg's miracles happens to be my father. As I said before, he was taken to a gathering camp, and when we found out that Raoul Wallenberg makes papers, of course they were false papers, but he produced papers that were like we would be Swedish citizens. They called it Schutzpass, what meant that it was a piece of paper with a picture on it, with the Swedish crown on it, and describing that this person is under the aegis of the Swedish king. Now we obtained these papers for the whole family. My then husband obtained it for my father, for my mother, for us, and the first one to get this piece of paper was my father. We sent it to him somehow by messenger to this gathering camp, not knowing what will happen. Well, a few days later, my father appeared back on the doorsteps. He was already pretty starved and beaten up, but thank God he was alive. And because of this piece of paper, what they honored, what the Gestapo honored, he came back into the family circle. So this was the first miracle that Raoul Wallenberg's paper produced. Then he also bought houses in Budapest and hung out the Swedish flag, and this he called Swedish safe houses. So as things were moving along and more curtailing laws entered the life of Jews in Budapest, my parents moved to one of these Swedish houses, and that is where they lived through the rest of the war. Now my then husband was in labor camp, but he was in a labor camp that was very close to Budapest on the outskirts, and he was kind of commuting in and out of it, what was not too bad compared to other labor camps. So one day he decided that he is going to just leave that camp and move into the Swedish legation. The Swedish legation was like the Swedish consulate. The whole building was under the aegis of Wallenberg and the Swedish flag. Of course, by then, the siege of Budapest was very bad. There was bombing, there was airplane fires, there was anti-artillery fires, and there was shooting from the Gestapo day and night. There were the police roaming around, there was the SS roaming around. And I, since I did not wear the Jewish star, but I had 3 sets of papers in my pocket, I was roaming the streets from my hiding place, between my hiding place and to the Swedish consulate where my husband was, and to the Swedish house where my parents were, trying to bring them some food or whatever was still available on the streets of Budapest. By that time, the Hungarian ghetto the Budapest ghetto was established, where they moved my grandfather. Now, this was in the middle of the city, in an enclave, and my grandfather stayed there during the siege of Budapest. Now, you have to know that this is the last 11 months of the war years. And we really had the tail end of it. But in that 11 months, 600,000 Jews were taken away from their homes, from Hungary, into exterminating camps. So we were very fortunate in Budapest that we had places to hide, and also that we had Raoul Wallenberg. Now, as a background to Raoul Wallenberg, I have to tell you that he came from a very prominent Swedish banking family, like the Rockefellers would be in the United States. And he was a young man, about 33 years old by that time, and all he had with him is his diplomatic pouch, some money from the Jewish Refugee Board from America, and the fantastic charisma and will to save Jewish lives in Budapest. This was his mission, and he certainly fulfilled it to the greatest of his ability. So getting on with my story, one day around before New Year's Eve 1944, after roaming the streets and going from my hiding place towards being a liaison to my rest of my family, bringing food and whatever supplies I can still obtain in the streets of Budapest, I moved into the Swedish legation where my husband was. By that time the whole building was bombed out and there were no windows or doors, so everybody was in the air shelters, what means in the basement. So the so-called Swedish Jews, and one of them was my husband, who were hiding in the Swedish legation, were also in that air shelter, what is actually the basement of the building. So one day in early January, a whole Gestapo brigade came into the air shelter, demanding for all the Jews to march out. I, at that moment, went up to the third floor of the building, even though there was no more much building, but we still had a telephone operator and a telephone connection, a switchboard, to the office of Raoul Wallenberg, what was a few blocks away. So as we looked out in horror, seeing our loved ones and all the other Jews marched out to the snowy streets of Budapest, we contacted Wallenberg on our telephone switchboard. The we meant another person who became a great friend of mine, who was monitoring the switchboard. He and me called up Wallenberg's office, and Wallenberg, knowing what the consequences will be for these people who were marched off, went out to the Danube in his car. Now, what they did by that time to the Jews was not shipping them anywhere, but just the easy way out, like this 100 or so Jews who were marched out from the Swedish legation. They marched them to the Danube, they lined them up, and they were ready to shoot them into the Danube, and that takes care of that. At that moment, Raoul Wallenberg appeared because of our telephone message, and he single-handedly told these people, the SS, that he cannot touch these Jews because they are Swedish citizens and they are under his surveillance and under the aegis of the Swedish king. And lo and behold, the Gestapo listened to him, and this was the second miracle that Raoul Wallenberg caused in my family's survival. So about an hour later, we were looking out on the streets of snowy Budapest, where the snow was falling in tons, and there came back the whole Swedish Jewish consulate people, including my husband. So that was really a fantastic deed. As the siege went on of Budapest, in the middle of January, we were liberated by the Russian army. And after the liberation, we started to emerge from the air shelter and started to walk back on the streets of Budapest towards our home, hoping that maybe there are some other survivors of my little family. I didn't have any sisters or brothers, so it was my parents, my husband, his family who were in other places hiding, and my grandfather. Now, I didn't know that time, but I found out later on in retrospect that my grandfather in Ghetto was also saved because of the efforts of Raoul Wallenberg. Well, that story was that as the siege of Budapest was coming to an end and the Russians were already at the borders of the city, Raoul Wallenberg was approaching Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann was the person who was delegated to Budapest to do the final solution of the Jews of Hungary. And he was in Budapest, and Wallenberg had a meeting with him. And he told Wallenberg that the next thing he will do is blow up the ghetto because the Russians are already at the doors and he doesn't want any Jew alive anymore. So Wallenberg told him and talked to him that if he does that, that will be the final bad thing that he can do, and we'll be the first one to be reported to the liberating army. So by Wallenberg's charm, miraculous charisma, persuasiveness, or God knows what, this terrible man, Adolf Eichmann, gave in and the ghetto was not blown up. So this is how my grandfather was saved. So you see, here is the 3 generations of us who were saved because of the efforts of Raoul Wallenberg. Now Raoul Wallenberg brought something to all of us as a reminder that one person can make the difference. He was just one person with really not much to go on, but his own wonderful, wonderful feeling that he wanted to save Jewish people. He should be a great example, and he is my hero, because he really, his mission was to betray evil, to go against hatred, to try to save lives. And you do not have to be a Raoul Wallenberg when you or anybody else is living in a community where you see peril or where you see things in danger. Everybody can do something to help other people. And this is the great legacy and lesson that I think Raoul Wallenberg can teach other people. Unfortunately, what happened as the Russians came in, Raoul Wallenberg was having a rendezvous with some Russian officials. He got into his car thinking that he is going to have a conference with the greater Russian authorities, and he thought that now that some Jewish lives were saved in Budapest, and maybe some others will come back from these unknown horrible places like the concentration camps, some people would have to be reinstated. And his next mission would have been to talk to the Russians and to try to reinstate these Jewish people. Now, unknown to him, this was not why the Russians captured him. And unfortunately, unknown to all of us to this day, is what happened to Raoul Wallenberg. As he was meeting with the Russians, he was captured and he was taken to the Siberian prisons, to the Gulag, and nobody knows why. There are only theories today and all this time that the Russians must have figured out that either he had American connections or maybe he was a spy, or anything that the Russians' logic would say. Of course, what he was not, he was imprisoned. The only thing we do know is that there were some prisoners, fellow prisoners, who later on reported that they saw or knew a tall Swedish man who would be described as Raoul Wallenberg, who was in the Ljubljana prison in the Gulag, and they were their prison mates. And later on, of course, some news came out, but none of it really was true, and we really do not know what happened. As the Cold War came to an end, and the Russians started to make amends, they said that Raoul Wallenberg died of a heart attack and his remains were burned. Now, Raoul Wallenberg could have been then 37 years old, what is a very unlikely story. Then when the Wallenberg family demanded to see the remains or to have something from him, all they could produce was his diplomatic pouch and his passport, and they gave that to the Wallenberg family. Since then there were other rumors that, of course, this is not true, that he died at age 37 of a heart attack, but nobody really knows what actually happened to him. Now, I hope to God that he is still alive and he will show up one day and I will be able to shake his hands and thank him immensely for all the wonderful things he did for my people and the way he saved my family and about 10,000 other Jews of Budapest. So I hope to God that this day will come. In the meantime, we are doing everything that people should know about what a real hero is, a real flesh and blood hero who set out from his own goodness of his heart to change people's lives, to save lives. And this is the lesson and the legacy that everybody should learn from the story of Raoul Wallenberg. Thank you very much. Bye.